Fine.
Greetings, students. Welcome back to the virtual classroom of Company K, 67th New York Infantry, the 1st Long Island Volunteers. In this video, we're going to answer the question, how did the soldiers fight? The soldier's weapon. We will begin with the structure of the U.S. military back in the 1860s, which differed little except in one important aspect with today's military. First, you would have the Army. Those would be the soldiers that are fighting on the ground. Second, you would have the Navy, and that would also include the Marines. Now, the one big difference, which should be quite obvious to all of you, is that unlike today's military, there was no Air Force, since the Wright brothers didn't invent the airplane until 1903. However, believe it or not, both sides used hot air balloons. Manned hot air balloons had been around since the end of the 18th century. During the Civil War, both sides would use balloons for locating enemy forces and monitoring their movements. However, they had to be incredibly careful keeping out of range of the enemy's artillery, for they made very tempting targets. Before we describe the Army in further detail, let's give the Navy their fair due and explain a little about their role during the U.S. Civil War. The North had an overwhelming advantage as they had most of the ships, as well as a deeply embedded seafaring culture, as you can still see today in New England and New York. The Northern Navy's main job was to enforce a total blockade of the Confederacy from the Chesapeake Bay all the way to the Rio Grande in what was called Operation Anaconda, the purpose of which was to blockade and strangle the South into submission by destroying their economy. The South did have some of their own vessels that did battle on the ocean, but most Southern vessels were blockade runners, swift, smaller ships that darted through the blockade to get out their valuable cotton and bring in crucial supplies, including weapons, medicine, and essential foodstuffs. The U.S. Civil War also saw the first appearance of ironclad ships, both at sea and on the rivers, such as the Mississippi. Submarines also made their debut, the best example being the famous duel between the Confederate Merrimac and Federal Monitor in Norfolk Harbor in Virginia. Both the Northern and Southern armies were comprised of infantry, the foot soldiers that comprised most of the manpower in the army. Cavalry, the horse soldiers that were crucial in being the eyes of the infantry. They would scout the land like radar, looking for the enemy. The cavalry also engaged in plundering, rounding up supplies, and wreaking havoc behind the enemy's lines by destroying crucial bridges and railroads. Artillery. The cannons fired by the artillery were used against infantry, buildings, fortifications, and ships. Artillery pieces came in all shapes and sizes, from small portable howitzers all the way to massive mortar cannons that could level whole buildings with one solid shot. As the common infantrymen made up the vast majority of soldiers in both the North and South, we'll speak a little bit further about how the soldier fought in the ranks. There is an old saying that generals are always fighting the last war. Now, what exactly does that mean? It's very simple. Whenever the military gets involved in a new war, they almost always use the same tactics from the last war. Before the American Civil War, the last great war were the Napoleonic Wars, fought in Europe about 60 years before. During that conflict, huge masses of infantry marching in tightly packed ranks, shoulder to shoulder, met face to face in the battlefield, unleashing volleys of musketry at close range, sometimes even leading into grand charges to break the enemy lines. Therefore, when the Civil War began, both Northern and Southern generals pulled out the old manual and began planning the same war. However, after every war, something very important changes that makes all of those old rule books irrelevant, and that's technology. Technology is always changing. Before the American Civil War, there was a great leap forward with the invention of rifling. What is rifling? Well, have you ever seen the opening of a James Bond movie? That's a gun barrel pointing at Mr. Bond, and those spiral grooves etched on the inside is the rifling. Those grooves make the projectile, whether as small as a bullet or as large as a cannonball, spin, therefore greatly increasing accuracy and distance. To give you an example of what rifling did, I used the description of throwing a softball versus a football. Now, if you throw both, which one has the greater distance and accuracy? Well, that would be simple. It would be the football. That's because of the shape and the spin of the football. During earlier wars, such as the Napoleonic Wars, or even our own revolution at the end of the 18th century, the men used muskets that were smooth on the inside, and they fired round shot. So when they fired the weapons, those round bullets would rattle around and come out and, well, not really travel very far. Since the distance and accuracy of the weapons were poor, the armies massed together in great ranks in the hopes of throwing as much lead across the field that they actually hit a target. With the invention of rifling, having those massed ranks together at close proximity was no longer an advantage, and the casualties were staggering. Now, the bullets used by the common infantrymen was called the mini ball. Now, the mini ball was conical shaped, sort of like a football, made of solid lead, and the end has a flange. I'll see if I can get you some closer up pictures. Now, this flange, as the musket is fired and the black powder ignites, slightly melts the flange, and it catches on the grooves of the rifling in the interior of the barrel. And that's what starts the bullet off on its spin. One other thing, well, lead is a soft metal, and as it heats up, as it's flying through the air, again, it starts to partially melt. And when this bullet strikes a target, especially a human being, it flattens out and it makes some truly ghastly wounds. However, we will talk about that in the medical video. Well, here I am, back wearing my old uniform as a sergeant, and a sergeant would be carrying a musket. Now, these muskets came of two primary types, one being a Springfield musket, and the Springfield muskets were manufactured in the city of Springfield, Massachusetts. In fact, the armory is still up and running today. And the other is called the Enfield musket. Now, the Enfield muskets were manufactured in Great Britain. Both pretty much were loaded and fired the same way, and they operated under the similar principles. Both the Springfield and the Enfield muskets were loaded through the muzzle. That's why they're called the muzzle-loading weapons. Well, the muzzle is simply the opening of the barrel in the front of the weapon. The size of the bullet is called the caliber. In this case, both the Springfield and the Enfield took 58 caliber bullets, or 58 caliber mini balls. And that refers to the distance across the opening of the muzzle, and that would be 0.58 inches. These muskets were heavy, about 10 pounds, and you have to remember that the common infantryman had to carry all of his stuff on his back, so you wanted to have as light a load as possible. Now, in order to make carrying these bearable, the soldiers would be given instruction in the Manual of Arms. And what this means is different ways of holding your weapon so that this way your arm doesn't fall off. This position is called the position of the soldier, or shoulder arms. When you first fall into the ranks, this is the position that you take. Now, this is right shoulder shift. Bring it up very carefully as not to poke a hole in my ceiling. And it's held like this. I'll bring my cap pouch. There you go. There you go. So you carry it like this for a while, and then the officer's call to shoulder arms. And you always go back to the shoulder arms whenever you're changing position of the weapon. Support arms comes out, and this way, the weight of the weapon is right here on your left forearm. The hammer is resting right here, and this is actually probably, well, this is certainly my favorite, one of the most comfortable ways of carrying the weapon. Shoulder arms, back to the shoulder. You also had something called trail arms, and you do this when, for example, you are walking through the woods and you have a lot of low-hanging branches. This way the barrel doesn't catch. Shoulder arms. You also have secure arms. Now what this does, it points the muzzle down. And you carry this during inclement weather, well, the rain. Now these are black powdered weapons. So if you get moisture down the barrel, it's going to get your powder wet when you start to load and fire and pretty much make these useless. Shoulder arms, comes back to the shoulder. Then there's also present arms. This is ceremonial. It's a gesture of honor. If you are in the ranks and there's a dress parade, you have a general passing by. Situations such as that. Shoulder arms. You also have order arms. Well, obviously, this is when you're stationary. You have in-place rest. And this is the only time that the soldiers are allowed to actually chat. This is at ease, as it would be called today. Attention. And you also have parade rest. Now this is ceremonial and you're supposed to keep your mouth shut. Attention. Shoulder arms. Now the officers, on the march, might also say route step. Route step is freestyle, where the soldiers are allowed to carry the weapons any way they wish. However, let's say for example for right shoulder shift, you got to be very careful not to lean it back too far. Otherwise you might have a Three Stooges situation. Now I'll demonstrate for you loading and firing the musket. It might seem very complicated to you, however, you always have to keep in mind in the 1860s, this was cutting edge technology. The first command would be to load. Musket goes right between your feet. Handle cartridge. You might remember the cartridge box, which contains about 40, sometimes 60 rounds of paper cartridges filled with black powder, and there would be a mini ball at the end of it. In this case, this is minus the bullet. Then comes the command tear cartridge. Now you need to have sets of opposing teeth in order to tear the paper off the cartridge. I don't know if it's a legend or not, but I've read stories where men would take their teeth out in order not to be drafted, but well, the recruitment officers got around that. They would just send them to the artillery. Next command is pour cartridge. There you go. Powder goes down. And the bullet, and this way you'll have to use your imagination, would be right up here. The next command would be to draw rammer. Now this rammer is a critical piece of equipment for loading and firing. You would need to then ram the cartridge. Now the mini balls are made of lead, they're soft, so this would get it down to the bottom where the black powder is. The next command would be to return rammer. And this is a very important step. And you always return the rammer with your pinky. And why is that? Because, for example, even today, obviously we don't use bullets in Civil War reenactments, but you still have black powder down here. Now, it's extremely rare, but if a spark happens to be at the bottom of the chamber and it does go off, then you only hurt your pinky. Now, when these guns fire, a sheet of flame comes out about a good 3 feet, which can give you a pretty nasty burn. That's why we keep our hands and our faces away from the muzzle of these muskets all the time. Now that the rammer has been returned, and there's powder at the bottom plus the bullet, the next command will be to prime. It's when I'm going to tee my feet like this. I'm just going to stand in profile so you can see a little better. Maybe get you a little bit of a closer of a shot. You bring the hammer back to a half-cock position. It's a safety position. It won't go off. You reach down into your cap pouch. And this is when you're going to pull out a percussion cap. It's brass filled with fulminated mercury, and it's going to go right here on this cone, which has a hole drilled down the center. Now the cap goes on this cone, so this way, when you bring the hammer down to a full cock position, pull the trigger, the hammer slams into the cap, creating a spark, which then travels down that hole into the bottom of the barrel and ignites the powder. Now once you have the cap on, the musket is loaded and primed, you come back to the shoulder. And you have to realize you're going to have hundreds or thousands of men jammed together like this in two ranks, front rank and rear rank. Now the officers, once they see that all these muskets are back at the shoulder, it means they're ready for the last commands, which are ready, aim, fire, bang! And there you have it. Well, this is what it takes to load and fire a musket. Now, a good soldier might be able to fire off a round once every 20 seconds, or that equals about maybe 3 times a minute. Now, obviously, during the real war, you have people trying to kill you. So, you might miss a step here and there. You also have the possibility of a misfire. Now, a misfire is when you fire the weapon, but the powder does not ignite. Now, whether it's in real battle or at a Civil War reenactment today, it's very loud. So you might fire your weapon and not realize that it didn't go off. So what's the next thing that happens is that you might keep, well, putting in more and more powder. And suddenly, you are holding a bomb in your hands. And if you get enough powder down there, it'll actually blast the breech and cause a very serious injury. That's why today we're extremely safety conscious with these weapons. We always inspect them before and after we fire them. There is one very important accessory for the muskets, and that's called the bayonet. And the command would be to fix bayonets. Now, bayonets have been around for centuries. Now, these have been common equipment on all firearms throughout history. However, by the time of the Civil War, the range and accuracy of the weapon had increased to the point where you simply didn't get close enough in order to truly use these for their original purpose. So, this became a utilitarian tool in camp. For example, you can use this as a coffee grinder to smash up your hardtack. You could use this as a rotisserie for some unfortunate chicken that's crossed your path. You could stick this into the ground, put a candle in it, and there you go. You have a Civil War nightlight. Or you could just use this for digging trenches. Now, there were occasions during the Civil War where the men did get close enough in order to use these. And I guess the most famous example of that would be the charge of the 20th Maine. And that occurred on July 2nd, 1863, during the Battle of Gettysburg. Little Round Top was a crucial piece of real estate during that battle. It formed the very left end of the Federal line. And the Confederates were determined to take that hill. If they had, they could have just rolled up the entire Federal infantry, and it might have meant the loss of the battle. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, unfortunately, he's got to be careful not to hit the roof. His men had run out of ammunition. So what do? He tells them to fix bayonets, and then he gives the command to charge bayonets. Ha! And they ran down the hill. And, well, just look at this. This is pretty intimidating. You want to get out of the way. So they managed to sweep the Confederates off the slope, and Little Round Top was saved. Now the bayonet has an unusual profile. It has a triangular profile if you look at it head on. Now the metal on the edges here is dull, so I can do this with no harm. Really, the only part that's sharp is the very tip, and that's all you need. When the bayonet enters the enemy's body, it tears the skin into a triangular profiled wound, which is almost impossible to suture. It's even tough today. And back in those days, when they didn't know anything about sterilization, a wound from a bayonet almost guaranteed infection and even possibly death. And because these created such ghastly wounds after the Civil War, and I believe it was during one of the Geneva Conventions in the early part of the 20th century, these were banned. And bayonets today have a flat profile. Now officers, like lieutenants, such as myself, would also be carrying their own weapons. They would have a sword and they would have a pistol. However, the accuracy and range of the weapons had become so great that it was very rare that the officers used these weapons in battle. Now the sword here was used mostly for directing the men. It is quite intimidating and it is beautifully inscribed. It gave directions to the men, and it was an important nonverbal cue, especially during battle, which can be quite loud. Now, if you did get within range of the enemy, you would simply pull out your pistol. Now, these fired 6 shots, and each of the 6 chambers in the barrel would have to be loaded separately. It was a time-consuming process, and you had to be very careful with these because, well, these bullets didn't have casings, so you might be firing your weapon, and the black powder in all of the 6 chambers might go off at the same time, and you are holding a Roman candle. Still, these weapons were handy to have in case of an emergency. One last fact that we'd like to teach about the weapons. Deadly as they were, 2/3 of the deaths in the American Civil War were not from the weapons, but from disease. However, that's the topic of another video. We hope that you've enjoyed and learned something from our video. How did the soldiers fight? The soldiers' weapons. Well, thank you for visiting once again the virtual camp of Company K, 67th New York Infantry, 1st Long Island Volunteers. And now is time for the question and answers. So you fire away with your questions and we will answer the best that we can.